Hirsch.
I'm Jim Carney, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education.
Over the last 7 years, charter school enrollment has increased by 364%. The target of both intense praise and criticism, these schools, while small in number, are gaining increasing importance in the New York City educational landscape. The Independent Budget Office recently released its first report on charter school indicators, including who they enroll, where schools are located, space utilization, and performance. Today, Politico New York reporter Eliza Shapiro joins me to discuss the data and its implications for charter schools in New York City.
Later on in the program, I'll revisit a study that was done on a related topic, school overcrowding, that last month was ignored in the capital plans for the Department of Education. But we begin with charter schools and Linda and her guest in the studio.
My guest today is Eliza Shapiro, New York City education reporter for Politico, New York. Thank you for joining us on EdCast today, Eliza.
Thanks for having me.
The IBO report on charter schools begins with the caveat that the report is not designed to answer the question, are charters more or less successful than traditional public schools? So what do you see as the significance of this report at this point in time?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of demographic data that we didn't know as clearly before this report that we know now. We can kind of break it down. There's a lot of stuff on racial disparities in achievement between charter and district schools, gender, geographic. There's sort of a lot, special interest groups. So there's a lot that we didn't know before that we know now. I would also say there's a lot of political significance to this report coming out now. It's always kind of a heady time for charters in New York City. I would say this year has been particularly dramatic, maybe the last 18 months on the city level, because Mayor Bill de Blasio has fought so much with these sort of very influential, very powerful charter school leaders. And on the state level, because Governor Andrew Cuomo has really embraced them. And so we're seeing sort of competing city and state legislation on it.
So let's take a look at what the IBO report actually found out. It took a look at the demographics, and you know that that has been a focus of some of the criticisms that have been levied against charters, that they work with a different student population. What do we know about who they take in terms of males and females, in terms of poverty background? What do we know?
Sure. Well, it's different across the sector. One thing that's really important to note about the city charter school sector is it's actually very diverse. I would say when you think about all of it, you should think of it as the sort of big CMOs, the big networks like the Brand Name Success Academy, Achievement First, and then the independent schools, which are typically one-offs. So we know from the IBO report that the independent schools enroll a slightly higher percentage of boys and a slightly higher percentage of students with special needs, but that the bigger network schools, kind of the brand names you know, enroll a higher percentage of minority students, of Black and Hispanic students.
But some of them, they also have fewer girls.
Yes.
I'm sorry, the public schools have fewer females, and the charter schools tended to have overall slightly more females than they did males.
Yeah, I mean,
wondering if maybe because boys have more discipline issues sometimes. I don't know.
It may well be. I don't think we have definitive data on that yet, but it may well be the discipline situation.
Okay. Now, you talked about race and ethnicity. You just said something very interesting in terms of that the charter schools, you say, have more minority students than the public schools?
Sorry, the big network charter schools have more minority students. Well, actually, yes, both are true. The big network charter schools have more minority students than the independent one-off schools, mostly in private space. Charter schools are 93% in New York City, 93% Black or Hispanic. So that's certainly a bigger percentage than the district as a whole.
And that's something that I think was surprising. I think some people did not think that. Okay. Now, when it talks about the income demographics, who's eligible for free lunch or a reduced fee lunch, what did the report indicate about that?
Certainly confirming a trend that we have suspected or that we've known somewhat about charter schools, which is that there's a higher percentage of free and reduced price lunch students in charter schools compared to the district. So if you kind of look at the district versus the charter, you're certainly seeing a very high percentage of minority low-income students in charters compared to the district, but within the district, there's obviously, since the district takes everyone, there's also a huge percentage of those kids as well.
So it may have been surprising to see maybe the income differences and the racial when it comes to the other focuses of criticism, and that is the English language learners and the kids with special needs. I thought the report had some pretty interesting data about that.
Sure. I mean, I think what the report showed, there's been some other reports by places like the Manhattan Institute in the last year that have showed similar trends, but what the report shows is certainly that charter schools enroll a smaller percentage of English language learners and students with special needs than the district. That's not the case universally across all charters. There are, you know, some charter schools in New York City. There's a school just for children who suffer from autism. So there are specialized charter schools, but the vast majority take fewer kids.
Right. I think that report said that that school is the only school that had those kids, actually.
And there are a few independent schools that do some specialized work with certain disabilities, but not many of them.
And so the kids who get IEPs, those individualized plans, they are mostly in the traditional public school.
Certainly, sort of if you look at the peer-to-peer comparison, they're mostly in the district schools.
Now, you brought up a very interesting point, and I want to clarify it for our viewers because I don't think we tend to think about the difference between the network charters and the more independent charters. And there are really big differences in achievement in those two. So you want to just, again, tell us what some of the brand names are and what might be some of the more independent schools that don't fare as well.
Sure. So the biggest charter school network in New York City is Success Academy.
Everyone knows
Everyone knows it. It's the biggest, it's the most successful on state test scores, and it is easily the most controversial. I mean, its founder, Eva Moskowitz, has really been kind of a thorn in the side of Mayor de Blasio. Putting it mildly, certainly.
Right.
Her kids, I mean, we found out earlier this week from the state test scores, her students are outperforming basically everyone in the state on these exams. There's some criticism that Success does kind of an undue amount of test preparation throughout the year.
We can get to that now then in terms of the achievement scores.
Sure.
And that has to me, you're right. I mean, once again, Success Academy, particularly in the math scores, did really, really well.
Yes.
You know, my own feeling on this is always that charters were designed to serve as learning laboratories for other schools. And if there is a school that is doing so much better than everybody else, I'm just a little surprised that they haven't made public what their strategies and techniques are so that other people could either reject or accept them, but at least could learn from whatever it is that's going into these successes. I mean, that's my own feeling. I always think, why not tell us what you're doing? You're a public school, supposedly. You're getting public school money. Aren't you supposed to share?
Right. I think that's certainly a very common criticism. I would say what Eva Moskowitz would say to you is that she's published a professional development book, which is true, and she has started very recently, very recent phenomenon, to hold kind of open houses. Mostly they're attended by charter school principals and teachers anyway, but technically they're open to the district. So I think there's some hesitance on both sides.
So now you're coming to the whole issue of, we'll jump to achievement since the state results have just come out. And I think, again, let's look at charters versus public schools altogether. I mean, what did we see in terms of how New York City students did? Sure.
So overall, overall, New York City students in district and charter schools made very, very small gains. Less than a full percentage point to a full percentage point in reading and math. So you kind of want to see slow and steady progress. This is certainly quite slow, although the scores are going up. Charters compared to district schools, charters as a whole in New York City, independent and network charters, outperform the district on math, as they have done in recent years. Charters really tend to excel in math. On English, charters actually did slightly worse than districts, about a 0.5 percentage point, I believe. So that's a really interesting phenomenon.
It's interesting, and as an educator, for me, it really opens up the question about what is it that is involved in learning how to read and getting those reading comprehension skills, and how we teach that and how we get students, because even if you can't do that.
I would also say one concern that is shared throughout charter schools and district schools that speaks to the kind of disparity on reading scores is like there's a real serious lack of writing proficiency in schools, which so much speaks to the reading as well. And that's something that Eva Moskowitz talked about, something that Chancellor Carmen Farina is talking about, and I think we see reflected here.
Well, reading and writing are very connected.
Yes.
The more you read, the better you write, and
Yes.
writing is a way of making sense of things that you read.
Right.
So they really are very interrelated. Let's talk about the growth in charter schools.
Sure.
The report really focuses on the growth. You mentioned earlier, do we have any numbers by how much they've been growing?
Yeah, charter schools have really been growing at an incredible rate in the last I'd say like in the last 5 years. I think the IBO statistic was from 2008 to 2013. There was an over a 300% growth in charter. So that's been aided both by new legislative policies on the state and city level. Certainly a lot of those schools were ushered in by former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who is a big fan of charter schools. So charters are really growing at a very fast clip, particularly the networks. I mean, Success Academy is adding 14 new schools to its network.
And where are these schools primarily located? That was a question people had.
Sure. So the networks, the kind of big names, are almost exclusively co-located with district schools. So meaning they share space with district schools in public school space. They'll share a floor, they'll share a building, kind of whatever the case may be. The independent schools, which are kind of the neighborhood schools, are largely located in private space. And private space brings with it a whole different layer of policy goals and problems because facilities funding and rent assistance is a huge deal there. And on the other side, for the network charters, it's really the controversy over co-location, which has been well documented.
All right, and what did the report indicate about co-location? Is it really having a negative impact on the schools in which the charter school is co-located?
I think the fact of the matter is some charters are co-located with very low-performing schools. For example, there's a Success Academy that's co-located in Harlem with PS 149, which is one of Mayor Bill de Blasio's renewal schools, meaning it's one of the city's lowest-performing schools. Right. That's true. That's factually accurate when you kind of look at where the schools sit side by side. I would say for the controversy, unfortunately, it remains largely anecdotal evidence, and obviously that means it's up for kind of spinning on both sides, whether it's going well or poorly.
Now, some of the boroughs, let's take a look at Queens and Staten Island.
Sure.
They do not have charter schools by and large.
Yes.
And we see most of the charters in the Bronx or in the Harlem area.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
I think the charter school movement in the city really truly started in Harlem. So, there's like over half the schools in District 5, which encompasses most of Harlem, are charter schools. So that's really a charter district. I think charter schools were always planned to really cater to mostly minority students. So that's why you see them a lot in the South Bronx, in Harlem, and in Central Brooklyn. And that's kind of where they've grown and where they've continued to proliferate. There happen to be a lot of really good schools in Queens, and I think people felt like there was maybe a little bit of less of a need for charters. When you have a bunch of really good schools next to each other, you don't automatically think you need a charter school. But the disparity between boroughs is really striking.
Yeah, it really is, right? I mean, I found that really interesting. Now, another big issue surrounding charters that I think the report shed some ambiguous light on was the attrition and the backfilling. And I just want to again just say for our viewers what backfilling means. When students leave the school, do you replace them?
Right.
And charters have been criticized for not doing a lot of backfilling. Right. So what did the report say about that?
So the report kind of gives us some preliminary information. We need a lot more because backfilling is really emerging as a really kind of interesting, controversial topic among supporters and detractors of charter schools. I think it shows that there's a lot of diversity in the city charter school sector in how and whether they backfill. For example, some schools backfill or replace students the whole way through, K through 8 or K through 5 or whatever it is. Some, like Success, stop after 3rd grade because their argument is once you've sort of been at the school for a certain number of years, it's too hard for kids to come from the outside and catch up with the kids who've already kind of been trained in the networks model. So some schools stop backfilling after a certain grade. There's a lot of diversity. I would say the teachers union would say the lack of backfilling shows that charters don't take all kids equally. I would say charter advocates will say they're widening the gap, they're working on their policies, and kind of stay tuned.
Well, it does seem like a luxury to be able to say that I'm not taking in new students because they're not comfortable with the culture.
Certainly,
I could say that about any school. I can say, we have a culture here, and if people come in at whatever point. Also, you know, I know we know that students leave the neighborhood public school and the charter school. Do we know why students leave the charter school? There have been criticisms that some kids are encouraged to leave.
Sure.
The Harlem Children's Zone certainly was accused of that many times, of having such a big deficit in numbers from the group who started and the group that ended up in 4th or 5th grade. Do we know why they leave?
Well,
I mean, we know
one frustrating thing from
the gossip.
From the perspective of a reporter is that we don't always get attrition data from schools, so it's really hard to tell kind of what's going on, how many kids are leaving, and we certainly don't know why, except, as you say, for, again, that kind of anecdotal evidence of a kid wasn't doing well and sort of got counseled out, or they were having discipline issues, or they couldn't cut it academically. But it's very largely kind of a gossip situation, as you said, and less rooted in fact. And certainly everyone would want to see more data from a lot of those charters about why that's happening.
The report showed a wide variation, and that surprised me, that there were some schools that, as you said, do a lot of backfilling. They really do replace the students, and other schools, I think it said that many charters do fill the seats. 23 schools out of 53 backfilled 90% or more. But then that means that 30 schools
out of
didn't,
that sample size. Yeah, sure.
So it depends on how you look at it. I thought that was interesting.
Exactly, yeah.
What does the report tell us about, from your perspective? Does it answer questions that we've had about charters? Does it cast them in a new light? Does it make them seem like a more viable option to the traditional public school?
Sure, I think what it really does from a reporter's perspective is add data that we didn't have on a number of topics. One common criticism that's actually been embraced by some members of the city council and certainly some union advocates is that charters keep a lot of their enrollment, attrition, demographic data very close at hand, and the public doesn't always get to see it, which of course is not something that the public schools, traditional public schools, can do. So I would say the IBO report doesn't I don't think it changes anything dramatically from a policy perspective, but it certainly gives us a lot more to work with when we're looking at these kind of emerging issues now that the charter school sector has really grown and become a real kind of mini district in its own right. Gives us a lot more information of how we can think about more English language learners, more kids with special needs can go to charters, how we can sort of, if there's a universal policy to be made about backfill, which causes so much controversy. So I think we have data now that maybe policymakers could kind of take to the table when they look at making charters kind of more equal.
I know for the co-location, they did talk about, again, variations. But, you know, the DOE uses a formula for space, and I think Jim is going to be speaking about that a little bit later on, that a lot of people have criticized. That, you know, they say that the DOE formula for saying that a school has room. Do you think they give thought to where they put? I know when de Blasio turned down some of the Success Academy schools. In retrospect, some people said he was perfectly right to have done so. They wanted to put an elementary school with a middle or a high school. They just weren't good mixes. Do you think there's enough thought given to how they do it?
You know, I think that the Chancellor Farina has certainly tried. She's kind of convened this co-location task force. There's a working group on school space. I think there's talks in place, but I would say the problem is there's only space where there's space. Some schools are vastly overcrowded. Some schools are extremely under-enrolled. And so there's classroom space where there's classroom space, and you don't want to have kids in the hall, which of course does sometimes happen in co-locations. But you kind of want to look at where it's under-enrolled, and where it's under-enrolled, that's where the charters will be. And the under-enrolled schools tend to be in low-performing, high-poverty districts.
Now, were you surprised that there was no data on school attendance? For some reason that wasn't they didn't have data on teachers and staff, and they didn't have data on school attendance.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really helpful to know. It's just like another point of comparison with the district that I think would be really useful.
Now, we're running out of time, so I want to ask you, for report part 2, what do you think should be in a report that we didn't see now that you as a reporter on education would really want to know?
I think more attrition data and more detailed backfill data. I really think that's where the controversy and that's where the heart of the policy matters are now. So if we could see a school by school, grade by grade attrition list, I think that would be instrumental.
And if you had to make a decision, if someone came to you, as people often come to me and say, should I put my child in a charter school? It really seems like they're doing so much better. What do we know? What would be your bottom line as to how the schools are performing?
I would say there is so much diversity in the charter sector. It really depends on what you're looking for. Certainly, if you want a relatively strict, super high-achieving school, I would suggest one of the big networks. If you're looking for a more specialized charter school that really has sort of community roots, I would look to the independent schools. But I would say you can find a lot of what you're looking for within the charter sector, but it also depends on whether you kind of believe in charter schools in the first place and whether or not your local district school is going to do it for your child, basically.
Any final word that you want to say about the charter report?
I would just say, like, it comes at a really important time. We're already looking ahead, honestly, towards the next state budget session, and I'm sure there will be education reform and charter legislation embedded in that, and it's helpful to have data as we look towards policy.
And controversy to follow.
Exactly.
I want to thank Eliza Shapiro. Thank you so much for joining us from Politico. A topic often associated with charter schools is the effect that they have on overcrowding and the overtaxing of resources in New York City schools. A study was done last year by the advocacy group Class Size Matters. Jim spoke to the director of the program, Lainey Hameson.
Late in 2014, the group Class Size Matters released a study on overcrowding in city public schools. I met with the organization's director, Lainey Hameson, to discuss the findings of the study. What is Class Size Matters?
So it's a citywide advocacy group that pushes for smaller classes in the city's schools and also provides information to parents and elected officials and other stakeholders nationwide on the benefits of smaller classes. One of the real overriding problems in the city schools, and one that is actually getting worse, is school overcrowding. And of course you cannot reduce class size unless you have space to create extra classrooms. And we have seen with some alarm how overcrowded our schools are getting, especially our elementary schools. The trend has worsened over recent years. And the median utilization rate of our elementary schools is at 102%. Over 400,000 kids in New York City public schools are in extremely overcrowded school buildings, and it's getting worse. And overcrowding has a range of negative impacts on kids, not just on class size, but the loss of art, music, and science rooms, special needs kids getting their services out in hallways, in closets, guidance counselors and school psychologists losing their dedicated spaces, kids having to have lunch as early as 10 a.m. in the morning and having no access to the gym. All these things are very detrimental to our children's quality education, and in essence, the state's highest court has said it's a violation of their constitutional rights to a sound basic education.
You recently did a study called Space Crunch. What exactly did that study find?
We looked at just those districts which were averaging over 100% according to the DOE's own data and the enrollment projections on the DOE's website. And we found that at least 100,000 seats are necessary in the capital plan to be built, or else our overcrowding situation will be worse 5 to 10 years from now than it is now. However, there are only about 1/3 of those seats actually planned to be built. So we need an expansion of the capital plan immediately. We need more seats being built and planned, and we need an objective third party to do a needs assessment for the schools, which hasn't been done by the DOE or any city agency in over 20 years. We are the only group that has tried to estimate what the real need of the system is. And last year, Kathleen Grimm, who's the Deputy Chancellor, when asked about this by the City Council, said no, they hadn't done such a needs assessment because the dollar amount would simply be too great. Now, you cannot solve a problem unless you know what the needs are. And the DOE has been consistently hiding what the real needs of the system are and putting out false numbers in many instances.
What are some of the specific points or some of the takeaways that you would like parents or teachers to have with relation to the report and with all of the research that you're doing in terms of public schools in New York?
New York City has had a chronically overcrowded school system that is getting worse every year. And if we ever want our kids to have an equitable, reasonable chance at a good education, we as a city must address this problem. The Bloomberg administration did not address this problem. So far, the new de Blasio administration is not addressing this problem, honestly. I think it's about time we did something about it. We are the richest city in the country and the richest city in the world, and yet our kids are learning in third world conditions, and that's simply not right. We did a statistical analysis. We interviewed principals. We interviewed parents at charter schools and district public schools. We took tours of schools, and we found deplorable conditions. We found kids having lunch as early as 10 a.m., no access to playgrounds, no access to gyms, class sizes in many cases 30 or more, up to sometimes more than 40 kids per class, crammed into rooms so small that it violated the building code and they didn't have room to move around, learning conditions that are absolutely substandard and should not be allowed in New York City to continue any longer. I urge parents to reach out to their elected officials. Their city council has the power to approve or reject the school's capital plan, and they need to take a serious look at this, because every single child in the city is right now being deprived of an adequate opportunity to learn, and we cannot be proud of ourselves as a city until we improve those conditions.
Reporting for EdCast, I'm Jim Carney. Welcome back, and now this week's edition of Ed Bites.
Thinking of going back to college? Here's what you might be reading. Inside Higher Ed reports that 10 of 121 campuses surveyed are assigning first-year students Brian Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, a story of redemption and justice. Other popular titles are The Good Food Revolution, Bad Feminist, and Garbology, Our Dirty Love Affair with Trash. Overall, titles focus on topics such as social justice, climate change, immigration, and racial inequality.
A new study suggests that dropping out of high school can be more damaging to one's health than smoking. The Washington Post reported on a study that indicated that 145,000 deaths in 2010 could have been prevented if adults who didn't finish high school had earned a high school diploma or GED equivalent, rates comparable to the mortality rates of smoking. Education does indeed seem good for our health.
A new study reveals that gender biases run deep, and unfortunately, among girls. The Atlantic Online reports on a Harvard study that indicated that teenage girls were not receptive to seeing women in non-stereotype leadership roles. Nearly 25% of the girls said they preferred male political leaders, while almost half favored women for gender stereotype management positions, such as child care directors. So, how much has really changed? Harvard psychologist Richard Weisbord commented that, quote, "These biases are still pervasive and insidious."
How important is it to play well with others? Well, maybe very. New research, which tracked 800 students for 2 decades, suggests that kindergartners who share, cooperate, and are helpful are more likely to have a college degree and a job 20 years later than children who lack those social skills. Those children also are less likely to have substance abuse problems and run-ins with the law. The study suggests the importance of helping children develop social competence early on.
That's it for this edition of EdCast.
Until next time, class dismissed.